Hey, hello everyone. The reasoning behind the project was that movement of populations across borders is a threat to achieving elimination of malaria in Cambodia. This is because it can import new infection, lead to the development and maintenance of hotspots of high transmission, and also help development and spread of drug resistance. Of course, the mobile migrant populations that frequent these borders, we know, are vulnerable to infection and also notoriously hard to target for surveillance interventions. And finally, as Cambodia gets closer to achieving its goal of malaria elimination, it becomes increasingly important to identify asymptomatic carriers of infection. So the objectives of our project were to describe the types of populations crossing Cambodian borders, to quantify the extent of malaria infection in these populations, and also to identify risk factors for infection that can be used to target surveillance activities in the future. So we chose 3 border crossing sites, one with each of the borders with Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. And this was to explore any potential heterogeneity between the types of populations crossing the borders. So we chose Sa Prom in Pai Lin province on the Thai border, Trapang Kriao on the Lao border in Stung Treng province, and Oyadao on the Vietnamese border in Rattanakoe province. For the rest of the talk, I will refer to these by the bordering country, so it's easy to understand. So what we did, we set up booths at each border point and recruited participants as they crossed the border. Now, participation was completely voluntary, and once we had recruited participants, we tested them for signs of fever, we tested them for malaria using RDT, and we also took blood samples for subsequent PCR analysis. Then we interviewed them according to a set of a priori risk factors for infection. So this is just a snapshot of our study population. We managed to screen 3,206 participants from the 3 sites, and you can see that they were predominantly male, in the 15 to 40-year-old age group, and of Cambodian nationality. Now, this would appear as if perhaps our sample is quite biased, and indeed the number of refusals we got from people we approached was quite high, at 23% overall. But we collected some observational data on refusals, and it appeared that the 2 populations did not differ in terms of sex, only very slightly in terms of age, but the main difference was in terms of nationality. So there were more foreign nationals who refused to take part than did take part in the study. So this table shows the results of our RDT analysis. And you can see from the 3,206 participants, there were 103 positive cases of malaria, giving an overall prevalence, or positivity rate, I should say, of 3.2%. And 65% of this infection was falciparum infection, so mainly falciparum. But the positivity rate in our study populations did differ a lot between the 3 sites. So on the Thai border, we only found 1 case of malaria, and the rate was 0.1%. On the Vietnamese border, there were 10 cases and a 1% positivity rate. And on the Lao border, it was much, much higher, with 92 positive cases and a positivity rate of 8% in that population. So we also took blood samples for PCR analysis, which is being run at the IPC lab here in Phnom Penh. Unfortunately, we are still waiting for full results of that, but this table is just to show you what we've gathered from the first 1,385 samples. So the important thing to take away here is the rate of infection, because hopefully that should not change too much. And you can see here that the rates are much higher, shown by PCR analysis. So overall, there is a positivity rate of 5.7%, and this climbed to 0.5 on the Thai border, 2.8% on the Vietnamese border, and over 14% on the Lao border. Just to point out that in our PCR results, the proportion of PF and PV seems to be much different to RDT. So it'd be interesting to see if this remains once we have the full results back, and then to try and explain why that might be. So this table is just to show the importance and the need to identify the asymptomatic carriers of infection. So we defined fever as a temperature over or equal to 37.5 degrees Celsius. And you can see that in our sample, there were 206 cases of fever, which we defined as symptomatic population, and 34 of these tested positive for malaria. This meant that 69 of the cases did not show signs of fever and were thus asymptomatic carriers. So if we were only looking for signs of fever at border points, we would have missed 67% of positive cases. So we need to be able to find a way to identify both symptomatic and asymptomatic carriers of infection at borders. And this can be done by looking at risk factors for infection. So these risk factors are our main risk factors that were significant in the univariate analysis and remain significant in our multivariate model. So associated with infection were fever, age, occupational group, forest goers, knowledge of prevention methods for malaria, and also having a previous malaria episode. So I'll just point out a few of these. So it's interesting to look here at the age groups. It would appear as though the youngest age group has the highest odds of infection, which would be surprising. You'd expect it to be the middle age group. But I need to point out that this lower group is based on very low case numbers, and the confidence intervals for those two groups completely overlapped. So we cannot say that with any certainty that this is actually the case. What's important to note is that under 40-year-olds are at a higher odds of infection than over 40-year-olds. For occupational group, we grouped security guards, armed forces personnel, and police together. Then manual labour workers are things like construction and forestry workers, agricultural workers, and then the other group were considered low-risk occupations. So compared to this low-risk group, it was interesting that security and armed forces had the highest odds of infection compared to any other group. I will also point out, sorry, that circle's a little bit high, but it should be around the forest goers. We define forest goer as someone who had slept at least once overnight in the forest in the previous 6 months. So you can see that sleeping just once overnight greatly increases your odds of infection, so over 5 times higher. These risk factors were significant at the univariate analysis, but were then lost, but obviously potentially could be significant thing to look for in any future surveillance. So sex was significant in univariate analysis, so males were more infected than females. Travel to and from Laos was associated with higher infection as opposed to travel to and from Vietnam, Thailand, or Cambodia. Also the length of trip, so before people were going to return. So having a trip over 1 week in length had higher odds of infection than less than 1 week or returning on the same day. People exiting Cambodia had higher infection than people entering. And also there appeared to be perhaps a time when infection rates were higher, so weekday compared to weekend. These months compared to later in our study in December, January, and February, and also in the afternoon compared to the morning. And of course, all of these risk factors are important variables to consider for future surveillance activities we can implement at the border. So the big question is, why was Traphang Kriau on the Lao border identified as a hot border? So why did it have higher prevalence? So if we keep the risk factors in mind, the following graphs, we have the border points along the bottom, and then this is the percentage of the study population. So this first one shows that there was a much higher prevalence of forest goers in the population that crossed at the Lao border point. So almost 40% of people admitted to being forest goers. And this is much lower on the Vietnamese and the Thai borders. And so it's an important factor. We can target forest goers with behavior change communication and programmatic initiatives, such as hammock net distribution. This again is showing the same axes, but instead with occupation. So I've put the highest risk occupation groups in red and the low risk occupation groups in blue. And that is quite hard to see, but in Laos, the prevalence of security and armed forces crossing the border was significantly higher than the Thai border, and the prevalence of manual labor workers was significantly higher than both Vietnamese border and Thai border. So again, these groups can be targeted for malaria control activities at the border. This one is showing that there was an increased prevalence of people reporting a previous malaria episode at the Lao border. So people with a malaria episode is in blue, and you can see it's significantly higher at Lao border than both Vietnam and Thai. And this one shows a very big difference. So the knowledge of 2 or more prevention methods for malaria had a protective effect against infection. And you can see, so the red is the knowledge of 2 or more methods, and in Laos it is extremely low compared to the other 2. So not even 14% of the population crossing knew 2 or more prevention methods for malaria. So of course this indicates a potential role for BCC initiatives at that border point. So key conclusions from this is cross-border malaria is a significant problem at Trapan Kriau on the Lao border and does require urgent attention if we are to eliminate malaria in that region. The risk factors that we have identified can be used as an algorithm at this border point to maximize identification of both asymptomatic and symptomatic malaria in the population crossing. This can also be combined with targeted programmatic and BCC initiatives. And finally, the risk factors do potentially offer a chance for any upscale of activities, so in the weekdays, the afternoons, and at peak malaria seasons. So how do we move forward from this, aside from putting in surveillance activities at that border point? Well, Malaria Consortium is committed to using these results and building upon them to support the national programs in establishing cross-border malaria surveillance at border points. So from this, there will probably be other hot border points similar to Trapan Kriau. These need to be identified and similar study taken place to see what the extent of malaria infection may be at those sites, and then targeted surveillance efforts put in at each one. These, like I said before, can be linked with behavior change communication and also programmatic interventions like net distribution. There is also the question of unofficial border points. It's reported that there's a high use of unofficial border points. This, I mean, in Cambodia is with no official passport control or border control. Now, Malaria Consortium has started looking into the role of this, and it's looking to do more work because, as you can imagine, there are certain challenges that come with unofficial border points. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays a role in this spread of malaria as well. And finally, the lessons learned from this study can be applied to other countries in the Southeast Asia region because population movement across borders is a common theme and will only become more important once new rules come in, I believe next year, that makes movement of populations easier in this region. So finally, I'd like to thank all of our partners and collaborators on this project, particularly support from CNM, especially Dr. Pali and Dr. Siv Savannarath, and our donors, UK Aid. Thank you.